Right now, back there, when we started.
All right, there she is.
Kicking down the door.
Okay.
I just texted you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was.
Okay.
So is there any cancel letter?
Okay, so,
I'm happy to, you want me to,
huh?
you want me to stay?
Well, I was just gonna repeat Elena, but then her team, but you can go ahead. Okay, Becca is here.
Okay.
We are co-chairs of the Climate Solutions Caucus.
And Molly, we trade off who runs the meeting, so thank you, Molly, for taking this over when it was my turn, so I broke the rules here. We are very lucky to have Elena Mahali, who is the Executive Director of the Conservation Law Foundation, CLF. If you are wanting to know what happens when a citizen suit occurs, to make sure that we are following the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements, if you want to know what it means in reality, this is the group that can help us understand the benefit and value of that. The reason we wanted to have Elena come and speak to us today is because there's a lot of misinformation out there right now about what does the Global Warming Solutions Act do. People can sue the state for millions of dollars and drain taxpayer resources because of our bill. You know, there's all sorts of bits of misinformation that have become really sticky in the dialogue in the State House. So we want to dispense with some of that information, give you some concrete information you can use to counter it, but also educate you about what groups that aren't in the State House are working on to make sure that our climate change requirements are actually being met. So we are so grateful that you came up, and we appreciate all the work that you do. So I'll leave it to you to take us away.
Thank you so much, Senator White. So yes, my name's Elena Mahali. I'm the director of CLF's Vermont office, which means I oversee all of our advocacy. And we don't just work on climate, we also work on clean water issues, on environmental justice issues, on other toxics issues. And a big part of my job is just cheerleading my amazing team. So I am going to do a quick pivot to say that actually the person that you want to talk to and hear from today is senior climate attorney Jenny Rushlow, who is on my team. Jenny comes to CLF after a long history of working on climate change issues at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And before then, she helped litigate a Global Warming Solutions Act case actually for CLF in Massachusetts. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Jenny. And then I also just want to point out our other energy climate superstar, Adam Aguirre, is a staff attorney at CLF in the back. So both of them are here to speak with you all and answer any questions. So I'll turn it over to Jenny. Where do you want, like,
Yeah, this is a weird setup for
where
the
do you want
room,
your
so-
speaker?
Yeah, do you actually, would you mind coming over here? This is where we would hear from witnesses, but you're kind of speaking to this audience. So that is a really good place. And you're gonna present to us, do you mind if people ask questions during, or would you like people to wait till the end?
During's fine.
Okay, so if you have questions, raise your hand and we'll try to get you at an appropriate time.
Would you like a chair?
Sure.
Yeah.
If that's one factor.
Or you can sit on the table.
Yes.
Or sit on, keep it.
Keep it casual.
Great. Well, thank you for having me in to talk with you guys today. So as Elena said, I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm a senior attorney at Conservation Law Foundation, Vermont. Previously, I was at Vermont Law and Graduate School, where I was a dean and professor. I was the dean of the School for the Environment, and I oversaw all of our environmental degrees and curriculum and faculty. And I taught climate change law and evidence and other things relevant to the work that I'm doing now. But before that, I was at Conservation Law Foundation, Massachusetts. And one of the things I worked on there that's probably most relevant to our conversation today is the lawsuit Elena mentioned, where we sued the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for failing to issue regulations under their state Global Warming Solutions Act. And that's a case that went up to the state Supreme Court and we prevailed, and DEP then issued regulations. And it did not sink the economy. They went on to establish a net zero requirement in the legislature after that, issued more regulations. So they have continued to go even deeper and farther after that lawsuit. So my plan today is to give a bit of a primer on the Global Warming Solutions Act and H-289, Governor Scott's bill, that would roll back portions of the GWSA and other important climate laws. And I apologize to those of you that were involved in the passage of the GWSA and know the details really well. But I know for some of you, it may be newer. And so some of this will be new for you and some of it will not. So I'm going to start by just walking through the components of the GWSA. Are you going to be going forward?
Oh, she declined. Go, Jordan.
Right. Thank you. That's good. So the mandates in the GWSA for reducing greenhouse gas emissions are ratcheting down our climate pollution by 26% by 2025, 40% by 2030, and 80% by 2050. Next slide. The GWSA establishes the Climate Council, which is a GWSA created body. And the responsibility for implementing the legislation goes to the Climate Council as well as the Agency for Natural Resources, or ANR. And the Climate Council includes quite a few members of the governor's cabinet, 8 representatives of major agencies, 8 heads of major agencies, as well as members representing various constituencies, such as distribution utilities, the fuel sector, manufacturers, those sorts of things. And the Climate Council is charged with adopting and periodically updating a climate action plan. And the plan is a pretty technical report that has recommendations, pretty specific recommendations for methods to cut climate pollution in all sectors of the economy, as well as resilience and adaptation measures to help Vermonters withstand the effects of climate change. Next slide. The next part of the GWSA is the role of the Agency of Natural Resources. So ANR is required to adopt rules that are consistent with the Climate Council's climate action plan. And the GWSA requires that ANR look at forecasts of emissions based on Vermont's greenhouse gas inventory in order to determine whether rules it has adopted are going to be sufficient to hit the greenhouse gas emissions requirements under the GWSA. So they have that kind of technical and mathematical role, and that then informs what regulatory steps they are going to take. If the state is not on track to meet their upcoming deadline, so in this instance, the first deadline is 2025, then ANR has to course correct, and they do that by updating or developing new rules. And then finally, the last element of the GWSA that I'll talk about is the enforcement mechanism, which is the citizen suit provision. The citizen suit provision is limited in nature. It allows Vermonters to have 2 causes of action. One, and both of them are against the Agency of Natural Resources. So one, if ANR fails to adopt rules, if rules prove necessary to meet the emissions reduction requirements, that's one way. The other way is if the rules the ANR adopts don't actually result in the necessary level of emissions reduction. A court cannot order ANR to adopt specific rules as a result of this lawsuit. So for instance, a court could not say, I know the clean heat standard is out there, why don't you just adopt that? A court cannot do that. The court can say, were you required to do regulations? Yes or no? The answer, yes or no. And if the answer is yes, did you do regulations? Yes or no? The answer is no. The court says, you need to go do some regulation. And that's the end of the conversation.
So let's say I heard from a constituent that us having the Affordable Heat Act language still in statute, I heard from constituents that since it's there, that what you're saying is inaccurate. That they would be forced, that if we don't repeal it, it's just on the books and we would have to do it. You're saying that rumor is not true.
Yeah, that's based on a misunderstanding of the role of the judiciary.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yep, that's the executive branch's role, not the courts. Now, next slide. So now I'm going to turn to H289, which I like to refer to as Governor Scott's climate rollback bill. And I'm going to describe how H289 would modify the GWSA if it were passed. And I want to just start by mentioning that while I'm focused on what 289 would do to the GWSA, that's not the only thing that 289 would do. So it also would blow up the renewable energy standard and incentivize nuclear. It would raid funds for thermal emissions reductions. None of those are under the GWSA umbrella that I'm going to talk about right now. Next slide. So the first thing that 289 does under the GWSA is it neutralizes the Climate Council. It guts the Climate Council in two ways. First, it makes the Climate Council advisory, which severs the council's authority to guide the subject matter of the Agency of Natural Resources rules implementing the GWSA. So they would no longer have an ability to direct what ANR does in terms of rules and regulations. The second thing that it does is reduce the efficacy and legitimacy of the Climate Council by removing several essential members that the legislature set out when the legislature was very detailed in how the Climate Council would function, who would be on it, what they could do, what they were required to do. Obviously, the legislature had a vision for what the Climate Council's role would be. And two of the positions that 289 would get rid of are the positions that Rich Cowart of the Regulatory Assistance Project and Jared Duvall of the Energy Action Network, those two seats would be eliminated. And so one of those is a member with expertise and professional experience in the design and implementation of programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the other is a member of a Vermont-based organization with expertise in energy and data analysis. Despite the fact that Rich and Jared are both very knowledgeable people, of all the members on the Climate Council, the description of those two roles are the people that are most likely to have expertise and knowledge about how to make the climate action plan work, how to make it effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions and drive clean energy progress. So removing those two positions has a really outsized effect on the ability of the Climate Council to deliver. Next slide. 289 also changes the GWSA as it relates to the rules that ANR has to adopt by basically capturing that process for the executive branch. Because 289 makes the Climate Council's role advisory, thereby making the Climate Action Plan advisory, because it comes from that council, ANR rules would no longer need to be consistent with the Climate Action Plan. That's the word that's in the GWSA now. It has to be consistent. And this would significantly change prospects for actual implementation of the GWSA. And we have evidence of that because we can look at, well, what has ANR done so far? What has it signaled that it's going to do? Well, it's done basically one thing. It adopted a suite of rules that includes recommitting to the California Clean Car Standards. Vermont has participated in that California program for a long time. Updating some wood heater regulations. But it's worth noting that in addition to H289, there are also bills filed this session that would pull Vermont out of the California Clean Cars program. So you take the one thing that ANR has done to implement the GWSA, and now there's a multi-stemmed attack to pull that back, which would be a really significant backtracking for the state of Vermont. So that's H62 and H65 that would retract Vermont from the California program. Also, the Rural Caucus, their annual bill priority survey lists as their number 5 priority prohibiting Vermont from using the California Clean Cars Standard. So there's definitely a movement toward getting rid of that. And as I say, that's the one thing that ANR has done. Next slide. And then finally, the last thing I'll highlight for 289 is that it would eliminate the citizen supervision. there's not much more I can say about that other than there's one line in 289 and it's, it says the cause of action is eliminated, basically. And I'll talk more about the importance of the citizen suit. Next slide. I want to touch on one other thing that H289 does, which rather than committing to 80% reductions by 2050, it changes to a net zero, achieving net zero by 2035, which on the surface sounds great. But a more detailed analysis paints a different picture. I would hope you would know that Conservation Law Foundation would not come in here and tell you net zero by 2035 isn't a good idea, isn't worth pursuing if we didn't have real reservations about how that might not be as great as it sounds. So if you go below that sort of superficial statement, it's because of how H289 would change what we count as our emissions that this is less ambitious than it sounds, especially when you consider that none of the policy actions that would actually get us toward any of these goals are being taken. So we can put a net zero goal in place that happens after Governor Scott has left office. If none of the policy actions would actually get us there are taking place, it's very hard to trust that that's a real commitment. Next slide. So I'm going to change course here. That was my sort of nitty gritty of what GWSA is and why 289 is a threat. And I'm going to turn now instead to sort of a more narrative presentation about why the GWSA is important, why maintaining it as it is critical. First, the GWSA is foundational. It is the only thing keeping our state climate policies from being a nice to have and instead making it a must have. As we know, appealing to some policymakers' better nature when it comes to climate change only works some of the time. Lately, not so much. And so you need something with teeth, and the GWSA is all we have. You can think of the GWSA as the hub of a bicycle wheel, where the hub provides the justification, the backbone, and the support for all of the spokes being our other climate and clean energy laws. If you take out the hub, the spokes fall apart, the wheel can't go forward. So if we want to have actual action on climate change, we have to have the GWSA. And you did a good job doing it the first time. But the implementation or lack thereof from Governor Scott's administration has stymied any action. And if H289 is now passed, we will have given up before we even started on the GWSA. We can't say that it's failed because we haven't even tried. And things certainly haven't looked rosier for climate change since the GWSA was passed. So there's no justification for going backward. Next slide. GWSA is affordable climate action. Affordability is important. I know it is on everyone's minds, not just this session, but all the time. But there are many reasons why the GWSA is good for low and moderate income Vermonters. It's a framework to help low and moderate income Vermonters untether from expensive and price volatile polluting fossil fuels. It has equity protections explicitly written into it to ensure that the benefits of its programs go first to more vulnerable Vermonters. In other words, if we didn't have the GWSA pushing these updates through equitable means, then it would only be the wealthy Vermonters that would be able to take advantage of things like heat pump programs, purchasing electric vehicles, et cetera. The GWSA plays an important role in making those programs affordable. And the green energy economy is booming across the country. Even Trump's efforts will not be able to stop that. And the GWSA helps keep Vermont apace to these changes. We don't want to fall behind. The other thing is that the GWSA requirements give market security for investments in workforce development. We know that if we have to weatherize X number of homes to meet our pollution reduction requirement, then that triggers workforce development in that sector. So there are many different ways to talk about how affordability is a goal that is consistent with climate action, and that the GWSA is the means for that. Citizen suits protect Vermonters. A law is only as good as its implementation, and without clear direction in legislation for implementation, then the GWSA is merely an aspirational statement from the legislature. And even if legislation does direct the executive branch to effectuate the law by adopting regulations, because the regulations are what translate a really high-level goal into what an individual regulated entity, what an individual polluter has to do. We don't tell them what to do, then there's no way we collectively are going to reduce our emissions to meet our emissions reduction requirements. If we don't do that through rules, then the directive becomes useless. It's only useful if it's carried out. And of course, there's always a risk that political schisms between the branches of government will stymie action. But to overcome that risk, it becomes all the more important that there are effective means for independent enforcement. And that is what citizen suits are. I think it's worth just taking a step back, reflect on the fact that citizen suit provisions are common tools to hold governments accountable. This is not unique to the GWSA. And we can give a couple examples of how these types of lawsuits have successfully led to the outcome of pushing the executive branch to deliver on legislative requirements. So I mentioned the lawsuit in Massachusetts earlier. That was in 2014. CLF represented a coalition of a few different organizations as well as several youth, and sued the state for failing to adopt rules as required by their GWSA. And as I mentioned, that was successful, and the agency did go ahead and do rules. And as I was reminded when I testified before the House Energy Committee this morning, a member of the DEP in Mass government testified before the committee considering the GWSA citizen suit provision to say, we think that's a good idea. Based on what we did in Massachusetts, based on the experience we had with the litigation in Massachusetts, we advise you, other lawmakers, that a citizen suit provision would benefit the state. Another example, not in the climate context, but analogous precedent for citizen enforcement is a lawsuit that CLF brought in 2008 in Vermont, which compelled the state to fix its insufficient Lake Champlain water quality cleanup plan, which you might recognize the acronym TMDL as much as any of it. And so that now includes a much more robust set of programs to ensure compliance with pollution controls. Unfortunately, Governor Scott has built a narrative around the citizen suit provision, vilifying this part of the GWSA that I feel the need to comment on explicitly. And that narrative is what underpins H289, and particularly the culling of the citizen suit provision from the GWSA. And the real narrative around citizen suits that I would implore you to keep in mind is that they exist to help regular people enforce legislation by the lawmakers they have elected when the executive branch can't or won't do it themselves. A citizen suit doesn't create any new obligations. It just presses the executive branch to do what the legislature already required them to do. And it doesn't give the courts the power to tell the executive branch how to do their jobs, because it doesn't tell the agency what regulations to do. They could never force ANR to do the clean heat standard. They could never force ANR to do any particular regulation or any particular sector of the economy. All they can do is say, go back to the GWSA and do what it says, which is, if you're not going to meet the emissions requirements, adopt some rules that would ensure that you do. And it gives the people the power to do that. Despite the fact that you may have heard from the governor's office that it is very expensive for the state to defend these lawsuits, that is absolutely not true. ANR is defended by the Attorney General's office, the government's attorney, which employs in-house lawyers who are salaried staff They get paid, they're at their desks, whether this lawsuit is filed or not. And their job is to defend and prosecute these kinds of cases. And while suits limited to the kinds of issues contemplated by the GWSA do take some time from the agency in terms of coordinating with attorneys, it is hardly costing taxpayers millions of dollars, as the governor said in his white paper that came out before H-289. And importantly, there's one more thing that I would really hope to drive home, which is that the Attorney General has a split interest in cases like this. They are both supposed to protect the welfare of Vermonters, and they are also to defend their own agencies when their agencies are sued. And in this instance, it is not really possible for the AG to do both of those things, which is why citizens are empowered to bring the suit that benefits the welfare of the people, and the Attorney General is tasked with defending the agency. Next slide. My last talking point is I want to help pull the threads together of the various pieces of H-289 to highlight the fact that everything about this bill is designed to consolidate power for Governor Scott, to take it away from the Climate Council, to take it away from the legislature, and to put it all within his umbrella. I don't have to tell you that the GWSA was designed as a group project. The legislature has its role, the executive branch has its role, the Climate Council provides robust public participation, as well as provisions that will require ANR to present its work across the state. That's explicitly in the law, is that ANR has to be very public and engaged with the community when they select their rules and regulations. But in spite of all of that, H-289 is designed to take power away from elected lawmakers and their constituents and consolidate it with the governor's cabinet. And in particular, I want to point out that in many cases, the ways in which H-289 does consolidate power with the governor are especially dangerous because they are subtle and they are buried in details in H-289. And frankly, I don't think the governor gives much credit to the public to be able to understand that those major changes are happening, buried in those technical details. But I'll call out some specific examples of how H-289 does consolidate power. One, it micromanages the distribution of funds between energy programs, saying you can no longer put it here, you have to put it over there, taking that power away from the experts. It redefines how greenhouse gas emissions are counted in order to make it easier to meet the statutory emissions requirements. It summarily takes away the power of the Climate Council and replaces that body with stakeholders with a cabinet members only body that would produce their own plan. So the council creates the climate action plan. H-289 makes the new cabinet member group create the climate action management plan. I don't know why you even bother to keep a climate council if that's what you're going to do. You're essentially eliminating it with another name. It removes knowledgeable members from the Climate Council that drive the details and make the plan more effective, therefore resulting in a probably less valuable plan without those people to help drive it. And this is a pretty subtle detail in 289, it shifts the appointment powers for the members of the Climate Council away from Democratic leadership in the House to a floor vote, and several other changes in how the appointment powers currently are for who's on the Climate Council. And finally, it eliminates the citizen suit, which is the primary mechanism for keeping the governor in check for whether it is actually doing what the legislation requires. And for better or worse, legislators can do great things, but you can't do it alone. And if, the second half of this process is just completely eliminated by the governor, then the good work that you have done gets lost. The death of the GWSA, the renewable energy standard, and thermal emissions reduction funds by a million cuts is mired in these technicalities that will fly under the radar unless you call attention to them. I'd like to refer to the way Governor Scott has been talking about affordability and climate change as his dog whistle, pitting affordability against climate change and everything else. And we can't let that be the prevailing message around climate this session. Governor Scott won't be the one that faces the consequences for his actions. He has pushed the necessary climate action out beyond his term of office. His bill is a bald-faced political tactic to avoid having to confront hard problems. And CLF and our members and our ally organizations, many of whom are here today, and the many Vermonters who do still care deeply about this issue, despite what Governor Scott has said, and the many Vermonters that called the Sergeant at Arms office on Tuesday when the floor vote happened in the Senate. Over 500 people called the Sergeant at Arms, in addition to the people that reached out to you individually. We implore you, you cannot let your power as legislators, as the creators of the GWSA, be usurped by a governor who is trying to bury you in details in order to roll back your climate commitments. Next
Thank
slide.
you.
We are coming up right at the end of our time together, so I want to make sure folks can leave. Thank you so much. We are obviously a nonpartisan caucus, but this was directed at the governor. So I do just want to put that out there. That's not a statement on any political party, more the actions of the executive branch. So since we have like 1 minute, is there a burning question that needs to be asked? Okay, you're on one question, Rick, and then we'll wrap.
So we have our plan, and part of our plan and part of the state has looked at relying on some federal money to help us, go through. This was money in the IIJA or wherever. And now if that money is disappearing, and we, miss goals, how could a citizen sue, how would it would look at that yeah, so what would happen if, we don't meet the goals and some of it maybe not, seemed reasonable, but maybe not in our control?
It's a great question. I mean, and it's true, we are in some times where that's difficult to predict. I would say that agencies not being able to spend out money that was congressionally voted on under like the IIJA, we'll see whether that is found lawful. There are lots of reasons why it shouldn't be, but some of the programs that would implement the GWSA rely on federal funds, not all of them, some of them do. And so I don't think that can be an excuse for doing nothing, which is where we are now.
Great answer. Thank you for that. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you spending your lunchtime hearing essentially testimony